January 2026, 7 European leaders stand together and issue a joint statement condemning the United States of America. Not Russia, not China, not Iran, but America, their protector for over a century. Their crime? Expressing interest in Greenland, an Arctic territory where American soldiers have defended European interests since World War II, Danish prime. Minister warns that American action could mean the end of the transatlantic partnership, a partnership built on the graves of over 500,000 Americans who died defending Europe. French President Macron, German Chancellor, British Prime Minister, all rush to condemn American assertiveness. The same leaders whose nations spent decades underfunding their own defense while hiding under American protection. Before we expose this betrayal, hit that subscribe button and join the Wealth Forum. We break down the hard truths about power, sacrifice, and ingratitude. This isn't a story about Greenland. This is a story about a continent that has been saved by America again and again, yet now turns on its protector the moment American interests are asserted. A debt measured not in dollars, but in American blood. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you need to understand what America has sacrificed for Europe. Summer 1914, the great powers of Europe looked across the Atlantic at America and saw a provincial backwater, a former colony of farmers and merchants. The American army numbered just 98,000 men, 17th in the world, smaller than Romania's. Kaiser Wilhelm dismissed the United States as a nation of mongrels incapable of fighting. British officers joked that Yankees were good at making money, but knew nothing of real warfare. These were the same empires that would soon be drowning in their own blood, begging that provincial backwater to cross an ocean and save them from themselves. When the guns of August 1914 thundered across Europe, the continent's generals promised quick victories. German troops in Paris by autumn, everyone home by Christmas. Instead, the Western Front became a 400-mile graveyard, stretching from Switzerland to the English Channel, consuming an entire generation of European youth. At the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered 60,000 dead and wounded before lunch on the first day alone, the bloodiest single day in British military history. The Battle of Verdun consumed 300,000 men fighting for months over hills that remain too poisoned to farm today. By 1917, the proud empires that had mocked America were bleeding to death, their treasuries empty, their populations starving, their armies cracking, French soldiers mutinied by the tens of thousands. Russia collapsed completely, and so in their darkest hour, the masters of the world swallowed their pride and called for help from that nation of farmers they had mocked. America answered, not because Europe deserved it, but because Americans believed in freedom. When the United States declared war in April 1917, it possessed an army smaller than Portugal's, 127,000 men, with almost no modern equipment. Within 18 months, America mobilized over 4 million soldiers, a feat European generals believed utterly impossible. 2 million American doughboys crossed the submarine-infested Atlantic. Fresh reinforcements while European armies scraped the bottom of their manpower barrels. At Belleau Wood in June 1918, American Marines fought for 3 weeks through a forest that German machine guns had turned into a killing ground. 9,000 casualties to take ground the Germans thought impregnable. When German prisoners asked who these fierce new soldiers were and were told they were Americans, one reportedly said, "Then the war is lost." The Meuse-Argonne offensive involved 1.2 million American soldiers, 26,000, killed in 47 days to break the German line and end the war. The armistice came on November 11th, 1918, not because Europeans had won their war, but because American intervention made German defeat mathematically inevitable. Over 116,000 Americans lay dead in European soil. Young men from Kansas and California, and New York, who crossed an ocean to save nations that had mocked their country. And how did Europe repay this sacrifice? They squabbled over spoils, nursed old hatreds, set the stage for an even greater catastrophe within 20 years. You might think that after being rescued from self-destruction, European leaders would have learned something about gratitude. Instead, they spent the interwar years crippling Germany with reparations, ignoring rising threats, pretending the war to end all wars had actually ended war. America retreated across the Atlantic, wanting nothing more to do with the continent's endless conflicts. Britain slashed military spending throughout the 20s and 30s. France hid behind the concrete of the Maginot Line. Everyone hoped, wishing hard, enough would make threats disappear. When Adolf Hitler rose to power and began rearming Germany, European democracies responded with appeasement and wishful thinking. Prime Minister Chamberlain flew to Munich in 1938, handed Hitler the Sudetenland, and returned, waving a piece of paper promising peace for our time. Words that became synonymous with cowardice, the lesson of the Great War, that Europe could not defeat Germany without American help, had been completely forgotten in barely 2 decades. Europe sleepwalked into catastrophe once again, having learned nothing, prepared nothing, changed nothing. German tanks rolled into Poland on September 1st, 1939. Within 5 weeks, the country was crushed. Britain and France declared war but did essentially nothing for 8 months. Then in May 1940, German panzers smashed through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely. France collapsed in just 6 weeks. The British Army escaped Dunkirk only by abandoning every tank, every artillery piece on the beaches, a humiliating evacuation disguised as a miracle. By June 1940, Hitler controlled virtually all of Western Europe. Britain stood alone, cities burning, merchant ships sinking, treasury running dry. And once again, Europe needed America. Winston Churchill rallied his nation with magnificent defiance, promising to fight on beaches and never surrender. But defiance alone could not produce the weapons Britain desperately needed. In December 1940, Churchill wrote perhaps the most humiliating letter in British Empire history, confessing to President Roosevelt that Britain could no longer pay for supplies it needed to survive. The proudest empire in history reduced to begging its former colony for survival. And America, despite having been burned by European ingratitude before, answered the call again. The Lend-Lease program provided over $50 billion in aid to allied nations, equivalent to nearly $700 billion today. The largest wartime foreign aid program ever conceived. American factories produced weapons in quantities that staggered imagination. By 1944, the United States was producing 60% of all Allied munitions. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion. Stalin himself privately admitted that without American trucks, food, and raw materials, Russia could not have survived the German onslaught. A confession Soviet historians would later bury. American aid kept Britain fighting, kept Russia in the war, made possible the eventual liberation of Europe, a liberation that would cost hundreds of thousands more American lives. On June 6, 1944, American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. At Omaha Beach, American GIs climbed cliffs into German machine guns. Over 2,000 casualties in a single morning to establish the foothold that would free a continent. From Normandy to Paris to the Rhine to Berlin, American forces drove the spear into Nazi Germany's heart. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 saw 19,000 Americans killed stopping Hitler's last offensive. 400,000 Americans never came home from World War II, buried in cemeteries across Europe, rows of white crosses marking the price America paid so Europeans could be free. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, not as great powers, as a devastated continent utterly dependent on American mercy and American generosity. And America, unlike any conqueror in history, chose not to exploit its victory, but to rebuild what European madness had destroyed. The Marshall Plan pumped over $13 billion into European reconstruction between 1948 and 1951, equivalent to $150 billion today, funded entirely by American taxpayers. American money rebuilt European factories, paid European workers, fed European families, raised European cities from ashes. It was the most generous act of national policy in human history. Victors rebuilding the vanquished, liberators funding reconstruction of nations that had nearly destroyed themselves twice in 30 years. But the story doesn't end there. In June 1948, Stalin tested American resolve by blockading West Berlin, cutting off all routes to the city and its 2 million inhabitants. Soviet planners calculated Western allies would abandon Berlin rather than risk war. They had not counted on American determination for 15 months. American and British pilots flew around the clock, delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies, the greatest humanitarian airlift in history. At peak, one aircraft landed every 30 seconds. 31 Americans died keeping Berlin free. Early casualties of what would become a 45-year Cold War to protect Europe from Soviet domination. The North Atlantic Treaty was born in April 1949, placing the entirety of Western Europe under the American nuclear umbrella, a promise that an attack on Paris meant war with Washington. At the height of the Cold War, over 7,000 American nuclear weapons were deployed on European soil, a staggering arsenal deterring Soviet aggression that Europeans could not have deterred themselves. At its peak, over 430,000 American troops were stationed in Europe, young men from Texas and Ohio standing guard so Europeans could sleep safely. American taxpayers funded bases across West Germany, Britain, Italy, Spain, and Turkey. The total cost of the Cold War to American taxpayers exceeded $13 trillion spent protecting a continent that would soon take American sacrifice entirely for granted. Here the story of ingratitude truly begins. Sheltered under the American nuclear umbrella, European governments began building generous welfare states, universal healthcare, free universities, early retirement, 6 weeks paid vacation. They could afford such luxuries because they did not have to pay the true cost of their own defense. American soldiers stood guard. American missiles pointed at Moscow. American carriers patrolled the seas. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet threat seemed to vanish, European defense budgets began a long slide into irrelevance. Why pay for security when America would always provide it? Germany slashed its armed forces from over 500,000 troops to under 200,000. The mighty German tank fleet shrank from over 2,000 main battle tanks to barely 300 operational vehicles, a 90% reduction. Britain conducted defense review after defense review, each cutting deeper than the last. Year after year, decade after decade, NATO allies promised to spend 2% of GDP on defense, then quietly failed to meet even these minimal commitments. American presidents from Eisenhower to Reagan to Clinton to Obama complained about burden sharing. European capitals ignored every complaint, knowing America would never actually leave. The arrangement suited European interests perfectly. Security without sacrifice, protection without payment, freedom to criticize American policy while depending on American power. In February 2014, Vladimir Putin sent Russian troops into Crimea. The first forcible border change in Europe. Since World War II, European leaders had to be dragged into sanctions, kicking and screaming. But as Russian aggression faded from headlines, European defense spending remained anemic. Only 3 NATO allies met the 2% target. European politicians nodded solemnly at alliance summits, promised to increase spending, flew home and continued building social programs with money that should have bought tanks. Skilled workers who knew how to build artillery, shells retired without passing on knowledge. No one was ordering military equipment. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled to dangerously low levels. Vladimir Putin shattered comfortable European illusions at dawn on February 24, 2022, when Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border. Suddenly, European leaders discovered war had returned to their continent. Real war with artillery barrages, tank battles, cities reduced to ruins. Ukraine fought with astonishing courage, but they could not have survived without massive Western support. And when Europe tried to provide that support, it discovered the terrible truth about what 3 decades of neglect had done. The European Union pledged to deliver 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine by spring 2024, then watched in humiliation as production fell catastrophically short. By early 2024, the EU had delivered barely half of what it promised. European factories had simply forgotten how to produce ammunition at scale. Ukraine was firing thousands of rounds per day, while European production struggled to keep pace. In the first 3 months of 2024 alone, Russia produced what all of NATO produced in an entire year, a 4-to-1 advantage. Once again, American factories stepped up, ramping production from 14,000 shells per month to over 100,000, filling gaps Europe could not fill for itself. By early 2025, the United States had provided approximately $175 billion in total aid to Ukraine. American taxpayers once again funding European security. American HIMARS devastated Russian logistics. American Abrams tanks provided armored punch. American Patriot missiles defended Ukrainian cities. The weapons that made the difference were made in USA. In 2024, the United States spent over $800 billion on defense, while European NATO members collectively spent around $350 billion. America outspending Europe more than 2-to-1. European NATO members finally reached the 2% GDP target collectively in 2024, a full decade late, only after Russian tanks made the threat impossible to ignore. And now we arrive at the bitter present, where European nations that could not defend themselves, could not supply Ukraine, could not meet their own commitments, have found their voices to condemn America. President Trump's stated interest in Greenland for American national security has united European leaders in outrage. The same leaders who spent decades failing to provide for their own security. 7 European heads of government issued a joint statement defending Danish sovereignty. Nations that expected America to defend their sovereignty now lecture America about respecting others. Denmark's active duty military is smaller than the New York Police Department, yet Copenhagen expects America to defend Greenland while condemning American strategic interest in the island. The same European leaders who spent years underfunding NATO now speak of American interests as threats to the alliance. European troops have been deployed to Greenland in symbolic defiance of the United States, forces that would have been more useful on Europe's eastern border facing actual Russian threats. Let us be absolutely clear about the arithmetic of this relationship. Since 1917, America has sent millions of soldiers to fight and die on European soil. Over 500,000 Americans killed defending a continent that now condemns American interests. American taxpayers have spent trillions on European defense. The Marshall Plan, NATO infrastructure, Cold War deployments, Ukrainian aid. While Europeans built welfare states, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was American weapons, American ammunition, American money that kept Ukraine fighting, not European industrial capacity, which had been allowed to wither. Yet when America expresses strategic interest in Greenland, where it already operates a military base under a 1951 treaty, Europe suddenly discovers principles about sovereignty and international law. The nations that expected America to guarantee their security bristle at American assertiveness regarding American security interests. This is the mindset of the dependent, expecting protection while resenting the protector, demanding sacrifice while refusing to sacrifice. The Greenland controversy reveals something deeper, the fundamental dysfunction at the heart of the transatlantic relationship. Europe has become a continent that cannot defend its own borders without American soldiers, cannot produce its own ammunition without American factories, cannot deter its own threats without American nuclear weapons. Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's alone, yet European nations collectively cannot muster the military power to deter Moscow without the American umbrella overhead. The empires that once ruled the world now tremble at threats they could easily handle if they simply chose to spend the money. European leaders lecture America about healthcare and climate policy while quietly relying on American taxpayers to fund the security that makes their comfortable lives possible. From the trenches of 1918 to Normandy in 1944 to the Berlin airlift to Ukrainian ammunition factories today, the pattern never changes. Europe stumbles into crisis. Europe cannot extract itself. America crosses the ocean with blood and treasure to rescue a continent that cannot manage its own affairs. Then Europe rebuilds, Europe prospers. Europe forgets until the next crisis comes and the cycle begins again. The graves stretch across France and Belgium and the Netherlands, rows of white crosses marking the price Americans paid. 116,000 dead in World War I, 400,000 in World War II, thousands more through the Cold War, all for European security, all increasingly taken for granted. American patience, American generosity, and American tolerance for ingratitude all have limits. The question now hanging over the Atlantic is how much longer America will continue to pay for European security, while Europe refuses to pay for itself and condemns America for asserting its own interests. Europe once dismissed America as a nation unworthy of serious consideration. Today, Europe survives only because America did what Europeans would not do for themselves. Now Europe lectures the nation that saved it, condemns the nation that rebuilt it, resents the nation that still protects it. That is the price of depending on others for your survival. And someday those others may decide they have better things to do than save you one more time. Here's my question for you. How much longer should America defend Europe when Europe won't defend itself? Should American taxpayers continue funding European security while Europeans condemn American interests? Where do you draw the line between alliance and exploitation? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this hard truth about European ingratitude opened your eyes, smash that like button and subscribe to The Wealth Forum. Turn on notifications, because we break down the economics, politics, and brutal realities that shape our world. The transatlantic partnership built on American sacrifice is cracking, and what comes next will define the 21st century. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, and remember, some nations are willing to sacrifice for freedom. Others would rather let someone else pay the bill.